The manifest was wrong. Herald diplomat Sorvith Kale noticed it first as a physical sensation, a faint pressure behind his secondary eyes, the kind that preceded calculation errors. He stood in the receiving bay of the Eternal Accord, the Conclave's largest diplomatic vessel, holding a data tablet displaying Earth's submitted inventory of decommissioned weapons. The list was 11 pages long. It was thorough. It was formatted correctly. Every serial number matched every corresponding filed report. That was the problem. In 43 years of disarmament negotiations across 19 species, Sorvith had never seen a submitted inventory with 0 discrepancies. Not one missing decimal. Not one filing error. Not one weapon unaccounted for. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the tablet and stared through the viewport at the blue planet rotating beneath them, patient and silent, and felt the pressure behind his eyes intensify. He told himself it was nothing. He was wrong. The Conclave's disarmament order had been issued 17 months earlier, delivered with the kind of ceremonial finality that the oldest galactic institutions reserved for moments they considered historically inevitable. Humanity had been a registered Tier 3 civilization for only 6 years, barely enough time to be noticed, not nearly enough to be taken seriously. The Conclave's Internal Assessment Bureau had flagged Earth as a manageable volatility zone, which was the bureaucratic way of saying they considered humans unpredictable in the manner of a weather system rather than an adversary. Dangerous in the abstract. Containable in practice. The order itself was simple. Earth was to surrender all military-grade weapons systems exceeding Class 4 yield thresholds, dismantle its orbital defense platforms, and submit to a biannual weapons audit for the next 40 years. Non-compliance would result in a trade embargo. Full compliance would be rewarded with provisional Tier 2 status and access to Conclave medical technology, specifically the regenerative treatments that could address the 3 diseases still killing millions of humans annually. It was, by Conclave standards, a generous offer. Every other Tier 3 civilization in recorded history had accepted within 6 months. Humanity had taken 11 months to respond. The response, when it came, was a single line transmitted on an open frequency. Earth accepts the terms. Disarmament begins immediately. No negotiation. No counteroffer. No requests for timeline extensions. Sorvith had been assigned to oversee the process personally, which he'd considered an insult at the time. He was a senior Herald diplomat. He'd overseen the Velthari accession. He'd brokered the Nethic ceasefire. He had spent the better part of a decade negotiating with civilizations that had faster drives, longer lifespans, and weapons systems that could sterilize moons. Being sent to supervise the peaceful disarmament of a species that had only recently achieved crude faster-than-light travel felt like being asked to watch grass grow. The first inspection had gone smoothly. Almost aggressively smoothly. Human representatives had greeted the Conclave inspection team with what appeared to be genuine cooperation. Weapons facilities were opened. Orbital platforms were powered down in real time, their shutdown signatures confirmed by Conclave sensors. Missile stockpiles were catalogued and physically dismantled, with human technicians working alongside Conclave observers without complaint. The humans smiled throughout. They offered food, which several inspection team members had been warned against accepting, given that human biochemistry produced compounds alien to most Conclave digestive systems, a fact the humans seemed either unaware of or entirely unconcerned about. Sorvith had noted in his first report, compliance appears total. Humans demonstrate unusual enthusiasm for cooperation. No resistance encountered. Recommend standard monitoring protocol with minimal staffing. He had meant it as a positive assessment. He would spend the next 14 months revising that interpretation. The third audit is complete, said Sub-Inspector Drell Vaughn, placing her own tablet on the table in Sorvitha's office aboard the Accord. Delivery records confirmed. Orbital systems offline. Ground-based Class 4 and above, fully decommissioned. And Class 3. Technically outside the order's scope. Humans have retained those. Sorvith looked at his perfectly organized inventory sheet. How many Class 3 systems are registered? Drell was quiet for exactly 2 seconds longer than a simple answer should have required. 14,216. The number sat in the room between them. That seems, Sorvith said carefully, like a great many. It's within the permitted threshold, Drell said. The order didn't place a ceiling on Class 3 retention. No, Sorvith agreed. It didn't. He looked back at his inventory. All correct. All compliant. Every number exactly where it should be. He thought about how the weather systems on Earth's northern continent had been described to him by the mission's meteorological analyst. A species of storm that built quietly for weeks over warm ocean water, invisible and unmeasurable until the moment it was no longer either. He filed his third compliance report. Asterisk, all terms met. Disarmament complete. Asterisk. He did not mention the Class 3 systems. He did not know yet what they were for. The fourth mystery arrived 6 weeks later and arrived quietly, which was how the worst ones always did. A junior sensor analyst on the Accord, a young Thressie named Pell, newly graduated and still nervous enough to report things her senior colleagues had learned to overlook, flagged an anomaly in Earth's deep ocean seismic readings. She'd been running routine scans as part of the environmental monitoring subclause in the disarmament agreement and found something she couldn't categorize. The readings resembled tectonic activity in pattern but not in depth. They were too shallow, too regular, and they had been present, buried in archival data, for nearly 200 years. She brought the data to Sorvitha's office at 0300 ship time because the numbers had been keeping her awake and she didn't know who else to tell. What am I looking at? Sorvith asked, pulling the display close. I'm not certain, Pell said. It looks like construction. Underground construction. Yes. She pointed to 3 specific signatures. These sites are distributed, geographically separated by thousands of kilometers. But the vibrational patterns are synchronized. Whatever they were building all 3 simultaneously. And they started building them approximately 230 years before first contact. Sorvith stared at the data. Before they knew we existed. Before they knew anything existed, Pell corrected softly. That's what I can't reconcile. These construction signatures predate their first radio telescope capable of detecting extraterrestrial signals. Whatever this is, they started it when they still believed they were alone. The tablet hummed faintly in Sorvitha's hands. 230 years of synchronized underground construction started before humanity had any reason to fear the stars. He told Pell to file it as an unclassified anomaly and get some sleep. He did not sleep himself. The disarmament had been declared complete for 4 months when the Conclave's Internal Assessment Bureau received an unusual request from the Nethic Trade Confederation, Earth's nearest galactic neighbor and the species most directly impacted by humanity's emerging presence. The request was simple. Could the Conclave confirm, with absolute certainty, that Earth's military capability had been reduced to a non-threatening threshold? The request was unusual because the Nethic had never expressed concern about humanity before. Their previous assessments had described humans as commercially curious but strategically irrelevant. Something had changed their analysis. Sorvith was copied on the IAB's response, a confident reassurance citing his own compliance reports, and nearly set it aside until he noticed the attachment the Nethic had included with their request. It was a translated excerpt from a human historical document. The Nethic Cultural Intelligence Branch had apparently been running deep archival analysis on human media for years, and they had found something they felt the Conclave should see. The document was old. Sorvith ran the date conversion twice to confirm it, because the number seemed wrong. It was 312 years old, predating first contact by over 3 centuries. It appeared to be an internal government strategy paper, partially redacted even in its original form, titled in the human language with a phrase that translated roughly as "continuity of civilization under conditions of external existential threat." Most of it was bureaucratic, redundant, the kind of long-term planning document that any civilization with a functioning government might produce. But the final section had been flagged by the Nethic analysts with a notation that said only "Please read paragraph 17. Paragraph 17 read, In full translation, asterisk, in the event of forced disarmament by a superior external power, primary conventional military assets should be considered sacrificial disclosure material. The preservation of secondary and tertiary strategic capacity requires prior distribution, geological integration, and timeline obfuscation sufficient to survive full-spectrum inspection by any known or theoretically possible detection technology. The goal is not to appear compliant. The goal is to be compliant while remaining capable. Sorvith read it 3 times. Then he pulled his compliance reports, all 4 of them, and laid them side by side on his desk. Asterisk, all terms met. Disarmament complete. Asterisk. The document in his hands was 312 years old, which meant that when humanity had looked up at empty stars and imagined civilizations that did not yet know they existed, they had also imagined what those civilizations might one day demand. And they had begun preparing. The question that hit Sorvith like a physical force was not what humanity had hidden. It was something worse and simpler. How long had they been thinking about this? He called Drell into his office and slid the translated document across the desk without saying anything. She read it. She set it back down. Her coloring shifted in the way Thressie displayed discomfort, a slight marbling at the jaw. This could be theoretical planning, she said. All advanced civilizations model threat scenarios. 300 years before contact. Humans are anxious by nature. It's documented. Is it anxious? Sorvith asked. Or is it something else? Drell didn't answer immediately. Neither of them said the word that both of them were thinking, because saying it would require filing a different kind of report. A report that would escalate. A report that would bring people with more authority and less patience for ambiguity. The word was patient. The IAB dispatched a secondary inspection team within 3 weeks, not publicly and not labeled as a secondary inspection. It was framed as a geological survey collaborative, which gave the team legitimate access to subsurface data without triggering the diplomatic tripwires that a formal reinspection would activate. Sorvith was not part of that team. He was told to maintain normal diplomatic operations and continue his rotation aboard the Accord. He understood this as a signal that people above him were taking the Nethic concerns seriously and did not want him to have advanced knowledge of what they found, because advanced knowledge might affect his observable behavior, and his observable behavior was part of what the humans were watching. He received the survey team's preliminary findings 11 days later, flagged at the highest classification level his clearance could access. He read the summary once. Then he closed the file, stood up from his desk, walked to the viewport, and looked at Earth. The survey team had found the first site. It wasn't weapons. Not exactly. The technology involved was consistent with what the Conclave classified as Class 2 infrastructure, support systems, power generation, long-duration habitat architecture. But the scale was extraordinary. The site they'd found covered an area larger than several human cities combined, built 2 kilometers beneath a mountain range in a geologically stable zone, and it had been under active construction, not completed, active, for approximately 40 years based on layering analysis. There were access points. Concealed, but not concealed in the way something meant to be hidden is concealed. Concealed in the way something meant to survive is concealed. Reinforced against seismic activity. Hardened against pressure changes. Designed, the survey team's structural analyst noted with visible discomfort, to remain functional following the kind of surface-level event that would typically require a term like civilization ending to describe accurately. Sorvith pressed his palm flat against the viewport glass and felt the cold of space through the material. The humans hadn't hidden weapons. They had built somewhere for their people to survive after the weapons were gone. Before anyone had told them they needed to give the weapons up. They planned for losing, said Drell from the doorway of his office. She'd received the same summary. Her marbling was worse now, spreading toward her temples. They planned for total conventional military defeat. Not just planned, Sorvith said. They built for it. 2 kilometers down. At minimum. The survey team found 1 site. The seismic signatures Pell flagged show at least 3. He turned from the viewport. The order stripped Earth's surface-level military capability. It did exactly what it was designed to do, But whoever wrote that 300-year-old document had already imagined the order, had already concluded that if an external power demanded disarmament, the logical response was compliance, visible, perfect, irrefutable compliance, while simultaneously ensuring that what mattered most would be somewhere the inspectors could not reach. He paused. We didn't disarm them, Drell. We confirmed their threat model. A long silence. Then what do we report? He looked at her. I don't know yet. That night, ship-time night, the arbitrary darkness the Accord imposed on its inhabitants to simulate circadian rhythm, Sorvith did something he hadn't done in decades of diplomatic service. He went back to the original contact record. Not the formal contact. The first recorded transmission humanity had ever sent that wasn't aimed at other humans. The signal that predated the Conclave's detection of Earth by 60 years. A narrowband radio broadcast, transmitted in patterns that bore mathematical structure, prime sequences, geometric ratios, the kind of ordered noise that said we know you might be listening in every language simultaneously. The Conclave's records showed the signal. They showed when it was received, when it was analyzed, when it was classified as non-threatening first contact overture from a pre-interstellar civilization. What Sorvith noticed now, reading with different eyes, was the timestamp on the human end. The signal had been sent 9 years before the construction signatures began. So the sequence was, humanity broadcasts to the stars. Nobody answers. 9 years later, humanity begins building shelters 2 kilometers underground. They hadn't waited for a threat to materialize. They had waited exactly as long as it took to conclude that silence was its own kind of answer. He flagged Sub-Inspector Pell for a meeting at 0600. She arrived looking like she'd slept even less than he had, which suggested she'd also received the survey summary or had drawn her own conclusions from the seismic data she'd found. The construction sites, he said without preamble. You said at least 3. Based on the signatures, yes. Could there be more? Sites using different vibration dampening, signatures we might miss. Pell sat down slowly. I've been running that analysis since I filed the original report. She pulled up a display. The answer is yes. Potentially. If they varied the construction methodology between sites, different materials, different depths, different seismic coupling, some signatures would fall below detection threshold. I've been looking for statistical shadows. Places where background readings are slightly too clean, too uniform. She pointed to a cluster of data points. I found 8 candidate zones. Could be geological coincidence. But none of them are in geologically boring locations. Every candidate zone sits under a mountain range, a deep ocean shelf, or a major tectonic plate boundary. Places where complex readings are expected. Places where extra complexity would hide. They chose locations that camouflage the signal, Sorvith said. I think so. How long have you suspected this? She was quiet. Since I found the first anomaly. I didn't know what I was looking at. But I kept thinking about the fact that they started 230 years ago. Before contact. And I kept thinking, she stopped. Say it. I kept thinking that they didn't just prepare for us. They prepared for the possibility of something like us. Something that might come and might demand things and might be powerful enough that demanding was sufficient. And they didn't build weapons against that possibility. She looked at him steadily. They built a civilization that could survive losing. The room was very quiet. That's not what frightened species do, Sorvith said. No. It's not even what careful species do. He looked out the viewport again. It's what species do when they intend to outlast something. The IAB delivered its formal assessment 6 weeks later. Sorvith received a copy with a cover notation that said internal distribution only in 4 conclave languages. The assessment was 47 pages. The relevant conclusion was on page 31, and it read, Earth's compliance with the disarmament order is assessed as technically complete and legally binding. However, evidence suggests the existence of parallel infrastructure not captured by the order's scope, the nature and purpose of which remains inconclusive. Recommendation: maintain current monitoring protocol. No further action required at this time. No further action required. Sorvith read the conclusion 3 times and thought about what it didn't say. It didn't say they'd found the other sites. It didn't say they understood what the sites were for. It didn't say they'd read paragraph 17. He suspected they had done all 3 and written no further action required anyway, because the alternative was admitting that the most powerful diplomatic body in the known galaxy had ordered a pre-interstellar species to disarm itself and had been, not deceived, because the humans had complied completely, had been outmaneuvered by a civilization that had started outmaneuvering them 2 centuries before they knew the conclave existed. No further action required was the institutional way of saying, "We don't know what to do about this, and we are afraid of what happens if we admit that publicly." The human ambassador to the conclave was a woman named Dr. Yel-Orin. Sorvith had met her 3 times during the disarmament process and found her consistently pleasant, intellectually precise, and almost aggressively transparent in the way she answered direct questions. She had a habit of answering exactly what was asked and nothing more, with complete honesty, in a way that somehow left you feeling as though you'd asked the wrong question. He requested a private meeting. She accepted within the hour. They met in the diplomatic neutral space aboard the Accord, a room with no recording equipment and a mutual understanding that nothing said inside it appeared in any formal record. Sorvith had used this room for sensitive negotiations before. He'd always been the one controlling the sensitivity. He placed the translated excerpt of the 300-year-old document on the table between them. He watched her read it. Her expression didn't change. "You've seen this before," he said. "I'm aware it exists," she said. "Were you involved in the planning it describes?" "I'm 41 years old, Herald Diplomat. The document is 300 years old." "Were you briefed on its implementation when you accepted this posting?" The pause. The smallest pause. "I was briefed on Earth's continuity planning, yes. Meaning the sites." She looked at him with clear, brown eyes. "Meaning Earth takes seriously its responsibility to its people under all foreseeable scenarios. Including forced disarmament by a superior power. Including scenarios where surface-level military capacity is no longer available to us, yes." He leaned forward. "Dr. Oren, I need you to understand that I am not asking this as part of any official process. I'm asking because I have spent the last several months looking at your planet from a distance, and I have developed what I believe is an incomplete understanding of what I'm looking at, and incomplete understanding in my position has historically led to serious errors." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to know? How many sites?" She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough that it doesn't matter what happens on the surface." The words were simple. She said them without drama, without emphasis, without any of the aggressive confidence that species with obvious military capability fell back on when they wanted to project strength. She said it the way someone states a fact they've had a long time to make peace with. Enough that it doesn't matter what happens on the surface. Sorvith sat with that for a moment. "You gave us everything we asked for," he said slowly. "Yes. Every weapon we identified. Every orbital platform. Every class 4 and above system. Clean, compliant, complete. Yes. And in doing so, you gave us exactly what we asked for." Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile. "You asked very specific questions," she said. "You knew we would. We studied previous disarmament agreements." She folded her hands on the table. "We read about the Velthari accession, the Nethic ceasefire, every precedent in your public record. We published those as diplomatic transparency. We know. We were grateful." She paused. "You wrote very clear documents. They were specific about what compliance required. We made certain to comply with everything they specified." Sorvith thought about the perfectly formatted inventory. 11 pages. 0 discrepancies. "You engineered the compliance," he said. "We fulfilled the requirements. You already knew what the requirements would say." She met his eyes. "We thought carefully about what a powerful interstellar body would consider sufficient proof of disarmament," she said. "We made certain we could provide it. And the rest was never part of the agreement." He stood up. He walked to the window, This room had a window too, a small one, and Earth was visible at the edge of it, blue and white and turning. I need to understand something, he said. Not for any report. For myself. Turned. Why did you start before you knew we existed? Before you knew anyone existed? Dr. Oren looked at him with an expression he didn't have a reference point for. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even confidence in the conventional sense. Because we're human, she said. We've always been very good at imagining the worst thing that could happen. We built cathedrals because we imagined permanence. We wrote constitutions because we imagined corruption. We built shelters because we looked up at a vast, silent universe full of energy and motion and concluded that silence isn't safety. She looked at her hands. It took us a long time to reach the stars. We used that time. The meeting never appeared in any official record. But Sorvith wrote something that night, personal and unclassified, in the private journal he'd kept for 30 years. He wrote about the seismic signatures that looked like breathing. He wrote about a civilization that had begun its most important work in the dark, before any external threat had materialized, operating on the human calculation that preparedness delayed long enough becomes indistinguishable from gambling. He wrote, they were never preparing to defeat us. They were preparing to outlast us. They were preparing to outlast anything. And they were doing it while smiling and handing us exactly what we asked for, with zero discrepancies, formatted correctly, confirmed by our own sensors. I spent 17 months overseeing a disarmament process, and I was, the entire time, inside a plan that was older than my species' first contact with theirs. He paused. I thought I was the inspector. I was the audit. 3 months later, the Nethic Trade Confederation requested an emergency session with the Conclave's full council. The session was classified, but the subject matter leaked through the usual channels within a week. The Nethic had conducted their own analysis of Earth's compliance record and had arrived at conclusions that made Sorvith's private assessment look optimistic. The Nethic lead analyst, a methodical and historically unflappable individual named Archassessor Teln, opened the session with a statement that became somewhat famous in the closed diplomatic circles that discussed such things afterward. He said, "We have completed our assessment of the human disarmament. Earth has complied with every provision of the order. Earth has also rendered the order strategically irrelevant. These two statements are not contradictory. They are the point." The session lasted 4 days. Sorvith was not present, but he received the summary. The Nethic had found 17 sites. Not 3. Not 8. 17 confirmed, with statistical modeling suggesting between 22 and 30 additional candidates that couldn't be confirmed without physical access, which the disarmament agreement did not grant, because the disarmament agreement had been written to address weapons, and the sites weren't weapons. They were something the Conclave didn't have a classification for. The closest analogy in any Conclave record was a concept from human prehistory, the seed vault, a place where what matters most is stored against the possibility that everything else is lost. But these weren't seed vaults. They were self-sustaining habitats. Infrastructure for long-term population support. Power systems decoupled from surface grids. Communication arrays pointed inward, not outward, designed to maintain contact between sites regardless of what happened above. Humanity had built a second civilization inside the first one, and they had been building it for 230 years. Archassessor Teln's second famous statement from that session was delivered on the 4th day, after the council had spent 3 days debating whether the sites constituted a violation of the disarmament order's spirit, if not its letter. He waited for the debate to exhaust itself. Then he said, "The question you are debating is irrelevant. The sites are not weapons. The sites are not covered by the order. The sites are legal. What you should be debating is simpler. What does it mean that a species, upon being ordered to disarm, responds with complete compliance, and then we discover they had already ensured that disarmament couldn't matter?" He looked around the chamber. They didn't resist. They didn't negotiate. They didn't fight. They handed us everything we asked for, and in doing so demonstrated that what we asked for wasn't what they actually needed. He paused. We sent a disarmament order to a species that had already decided conventional weapons were their least important asset. Silence in the chamber. We assumed, he continued, that the things we could see were the things that mattered. Humanity has apparently been operating on a different assumption for quite some time. Dr. Oren was recalled to Earth for consultations after the council session. Sorvith received a brief message from her before her departure, unofficial, through the same neutral channel they'd used for their private meeting. It said, "I imagine this has been a confusing few months. For what it's worth, we weren't trying to deceive you. We were trying to survive you. There's a difference. We weren't certain which one you'd be, a partner or a threat. We prepared for both. We hope it's the former. We are prepared for the latter. I suspect you'll find that sentence either reassuring or alarming depending on which side of it you're on." He read it twice. Then he went to the viewport. Earth turned below him, slow and blue and enormously patient, the way things are patient when they are not afraid of time. He thought about paragraph 17 of a 300-year-old document. He thought about construction vibrations that looked like breathing, synchronized across thousands of kilometers, maintained for 2 centuries before the stars had answered. He thought about a woman sitting across a table from him saying enough that it doesn't matter what happens on the surface without emphasis and without fear. He thought about how the conclave had looked at humanity and seen a Tier 3 civilization, young, aggressive, unpredictable, manageable, and had issued a disarmament order backed by the full weight of galactic institutional authority. And humanity had looked back at the conclave, and at the order, and at 43 years of precedent across 19 species, and had said, "Yes, of course, here is everything you asked for, formatted correctly, 0 discrepancies." And had kept building. He filed his final report the next morning. It was 12 lines long, which was unusually short for a document covering 17 months of work. Most of it was administrative. The last 3 lines were the ones he would think about for the rest of his career. He wrote, "Earth has complied with all provisions of the disarmament order. Compliance is total, confirmed, and legally incontestable. However, I am compelled to note, for the record, that this assessment covers only the provisions of the order as written. The order was written by us. The compliance was engineered by them. I do not believe these 2 facts, considered together, produce the conclusion we intended when we issued the order. I believe they produce the conclusion humanity intended when they accepted it." He submitted the report. Then he sat for a long time in his chair and thought about the word patient, and what it meant when applied not to an individual, not to a philosophy, but to a species. A species that looked at an empty universe and saw not emptiness but anticipation. A species that built for centuries against possibilities that hadn't materialized yet and might not. A species that handed over weapons it had already decided were secondary and called that compliance. The conclave would deliberate. It would commission studies. It would debate jurisdiction and intent and the letter of the law versus the spirit, and it would eventually produce a formal policy recommendation that would take another 2 years and a committee of 40 to finalize. Humanity would wait. Humanity, Sorvith had come to understand, was extraordinarily good at waiting. Not the waiting of the weak, who wait because they have no other option. The waiting of something that has already done its work, that has placed everything necessary into the dark and deep and slow-moving places where time cannot easily reach it, and that can therefore watch the surface-level drama of galactic politics with the calm of something that knows its own continuation is not contingent on the outcome. The strongest species in the galaxy had told them to disarm. They had said, "Yes, of course." And then they had gone back to doing what they had always been doing, what they had been doing before anyone knew they existed, what they would continue doing long after every conference and council session and diplomatic crisis had run its course. Building the next version of themselves, quietly, underground, in the dark, in the only way that mattered. Not louder, not stronger, deeper.